what many people in the West don't appreciate, and in fact, disappointingly, many people in the Islamic world don't know or don't remember, is that there was this period of huge scientific achievement halfway between the ancient Greeks, which we all know very well were great scientists and philosophers, Aristotle and Archimedes and so on, and the European Renaissance, the age of Newton and Galileo. But for many people, nothing happened in between, that there were these dark ages. And what they forget is that there were only dark ages in Western Europe. There are many parts of the world which flourished civilizations. My name is Jim al-Khalili, and I'm both a professor of physics here at the University of Surrey, but also a professor of the public engagement in science. I grew up in Iraq, and so I went to school in Iraq, and in common with many countries, if you do well at school, you're expected to go into medicine, and if not medicine, maybe law. But to study science wasn't seen as something that bright kids should be doing as a choice. But I was lucky enough to have a very good physics teacher when I was about 12 or 13 years old, and he really inspired me. And I think from then on I decided, wow, physics, that's what I want to do. That asks the big questions about the universe and how everything works. And so when I came over to Britain just to carry out my O-levels and A-levels and study for university, it wasn't a case of worrying about what to do. I knew I wanted to be a physicist. I was very honoured in 2007 when I received a letter from the Royal Society in London, which is the Learned Society for Science, saying that I'd been awarded what's called the Michael Faraday Prize for Science Communication. I was thrilled because I knew about this prize, and other people who'd won it included David Attenborough, Robert Winston, Richard Dawkins, the big names in British science and science communication. So I was very thrilled and honoured to receive it. What it meant was that I had to deliver a lecture on an area of science of my choice. Now, I could have chosen my own research area of nuclear physics, but I thought that would be quite dry. And as it happened, my then and still current project of interest is in fact on the contributions to science of during the golden age of Islam. Partly for cultural reasons, because I grew up in Iraq, I was so fascinated by this subject. So I gave a talk on the House of Wisdom, which was this possibly mythical academy that was built in Baghdad in the 9th century, where many scholars came together and developed, and it was a whole explosion in areas of science, including mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. It was amazing, not only how well received this lecture was, but the interest it generated afterwards, including in the media. So it's clearly a subject which I think there's a huge thirst for. What many people in the West don't appreciate, and in fact, disappointingly, many people in the Islamic world don't know or don't remember, is that there was this period of huge scientific achievement halfway between the ancient Greeks, which we all know very well were great scientists and philosophers, Aristotle and Archimedes and so on, and the European Renaissance, the age of Newton and Galileo. But for many people, nothing happened in between, that there were these dark ages. And what they forget is that there were only dark ages in Western Europe. There are many parts of the world which flourished, civilizations flourished. And with the spread of Islam in the 7th and 8th century, there was suddenly a thirst to understand the world, mainly driven by the scholars and the caliphs of particularly the Abbasid Empire, to understand God's creation, to understand and be able to reinterpret and understand the meaning of the words in the Quran. That drove them to try and learn about the world around them. So they began by translating the great Greek texts, the books by people like Euclid, the mathematician, Ptolemy, the astronomer, Galen, the physician, Aristotle, the philosopher, translating these into Arabic and then extending and adding their new work. Now, of course, these scientists in the Muslim world weren't all Arabs. Many were Persian, and many came from various other. There were a lot of scholars who weren't even Muslims, but they all wrote and discussed their science in Arabic. So it became what we call Arabic science, and it left a legacy which to this day has major impact. In fact, it helped generate and kickstart the European Renaissance. And it's quite a shame that we somehow now have forgotten this contribution, apart from maybe one or two scholars who are famous in the West, people like Avicenna and Averroes. But what's forgotten is some of the other great scholars and what they achieved. And people are often very, very surprised when they hear just how important some of these discoveries actually were. At the moment, I'm in a very exciting period in my life because I'm filming, presenting a new 3-part series for the BBC called Science and Islam. And it looks at the history of the golden age of Islam and the various scientific achievements that were carried out. So I've had the privilege of being able to travel to some exotic locations for filming. We've been to Egypt and Syria and Iran, Spain and Italy, where some of this science then the route it passed through to Europe. And I've learnt a lot along the way. I've also started writing a book on the subject. So although I'm a physicist, I'm not a historian or historian of science, this hobby has become something that's really, really taken hold. Some wonderful nuggets that I've discovered that I was only vaguely aware of. For instance, Muslim scholars invented algebra. In fact, the word algebra comes from the Arabic al-jabr, which is to do with how you manipulate symbols in an equation. And the whole field got kick-started by Arab and Muslim scholars. There were many developments like first discovering how blood circulates in the body, first calculating accurately the size of the Earth and naming of stars, developing medical techniques, anatomy, developing philosophical ideas. There's some beautiful stories, which are the sort of things that people would like to just to show off in dinner parties. Did you know that, for instance, such and such? And there's just a whole host of them that my mind's buzzing with all these ideas that I feel I should have known about, and certainly I think everyone else should be knowing about. Many people in the West will have heard of a few of the great Islamic scholars. Avicenna or Ibn Sina was the great medieval philosopher and physician. There are others which they won't have heard of but should have heard of. There's the great polymath al-Biruni, who was a Persian. He was a mathematician, an astronomer, a geographer, a historian. He was a polymath. He was the Islamic Leonardo da Vinci. But probably for me, the character, the figure who's been most inspiring was actually an Iraqi physicist called Ibn al-Haytham. He was the person who first described how we see objects. Until he came along, no one could agree whether we see objects because light shines out from our eyes onto the objects, or whether it's light from the objects that shines into our eyes. Ibn al-Haytham explained that it's the latter, that light from the objects bounces into our eyes. He explained it by developing the whole field of optics. Now, we learn at school that Isaac Newton invented optics, in a sense. Ibn al-Haytham did a lot of this before him. Ibn al-Haytham, for me, was the first real physicist. He was also probably the first person to understand how science works. So he is the father of the scientific method, the way that you develop ideas mathematically, the way that you carry out experiments to check your theories, and if your theories are wrong, you throw them away and try and understand the experiment in a different way. That's how we do science today. That's the scientific method. For most people, they don't appreciate that the scientific method was developed as early as Ibn al-Haytham, who lived in the 10th and 11th century. They believe it happened much later in Europe. Well, here's a guy Ibn al-Haytham, who developed a lot of science, a lot of maths, a lot of astronomy, hundreds of years before Isaac Newton came along. So he is now officially my #1 scientific hero.